The moment we stepped off the boat, the salty ocean breeze kissed my face, attempting to wash away months of exhaustion. The island was picturesque, white sands stretching into the horizon, blue skies above, and palm trees swaying gently in the wind. We had come here as a family, me, my husband Jacob, my mother Scarlett, and my stepbrother Henry. This vacation, according to Jacob, was supposed to be our remedy, a chance to rediscover the ease that had slipped from our relationship. Well, what do you think? Impressive, right? Jacob asked, flashing a hopeful smile. His eyes sparkled with optimism, as if he truly believed that this island paradise could be the cure for all that ailed us. Yeah, it's beautiful, I replied, though my voice lacked the conviction he expected. Beneath the serene beauty, a creeping sense of unease lingered. The calmness of the island felt too perfect, almost as if it were hiding something deeper, something unresolved within me. Mom quickly filled the air with chatter about the coming days, excursions, dinners, beach walks. She was always full of energy, even when I struggled to keep pace with her enthusiasm. I booked us a table at a restaurant by the shore. They said the sunset there is to die for, she said, grinning. Great, Mom. We could all use that, Jacob added, echoing her joy. His happiness was contagious, but I found myself drifting inward, my thoughts wandering far from the cheerful conversations around me. You don't seem excited, Sarah, Henry's voice suddenly cut through my haze. It wasn't a question, it was more of a statement. His gaze lingered on me, causing a ripple of discomfort to rise in my chest. I'm just tired from the flight, I responded quickly, avoiding his eyes. It's nothing. Henry smiled softly. A walk before dinner might help, clear your head. Maybe, I said, trying to keep the conversation at bay. But something in his words, his tone, stirred a vulnerability in me that I wasn't ready to face. The bungalow we were staying in was perfect, almost too perfect. White walls, large windows overlooking the beach. It all seemed designed to give an illusion of peace. But as I stood by the window, watching the waves crash gently against the shore, I felt like a stranger in my own thoughts. You seem distracted, Jacob said, his voice gentle as he approached from behind, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. I'm fine, I replied, the words automatic now, as if they were meant more to convince myself than him. It was the same reassurance I had been repeating for weeks, maybe even months. I was hoping this trip would help us reconnect, Jacob said cautiously, his optimism slightly faltering. Yes, a vacation is a good idea, I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. His touch once comforted me, but now it felt distant, like we were separated by an invisible chasm. Once we could sit together in silence, feeling deeply connected even without words. Now the silence between us only emphasized the growing distance. Later that night, as we sat on the terrace of a beachside restaurant, I found myself seated next to Henry again. Jacob and Mom were deep in conversation about tomorrow's plans, an excursion I had already decided to opt out of. I needed some time alone, space to sort through the mess of thoughts and emotions that had been suffocating me. But Henry had other plans. You coming with us tomorrow? Henry leaned in, his voice low, cutting through the hum of the restaurant. I'm not sure. I think I need some time by myself. You've been saying that a lot lately, he said, a knowing look in his eyes. His words felt pointed, like he saw through me, and that made me uneasy. Sometimes you just need space, I replied, trying to brush it off. True, he said softly, but sometimes in that space you get lost. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I didn't want to explore. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I slipped out of the bungalow, seeking the quiet of the beach. The soft lapping of the waves offered a temporary reprieve from my thoughts. but it wasn't long before Henry found me there. "Couldn't you sleep either?" he asked, his presence uncomfortably close. "No," I muttered, keeping my gaze on the ocean, trying to maintain some distance. But his proximity made my skin tingle with awareness, a sensation I couldn't shake. "Mind if I join you?" he asked casually, as if unaware of the tension simmering between us. "Sure," I sighed, though everything inside me screamed against it. We walked along the shore in a silence that felt anything but casual. His presence was overwhelming, stirring emotions I didn't want to confront. And then, just as the waves met the shore, Henry broke the silence with a question that hit me like a tidal wave. "Do you think Jacob knows how you feel?" I stopped dead in my tracks, turning to face him. "What?" "You've changed, Sarah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're unhappy. It's obvious." I couldn't deny the truth in his words, but I tried to deflect. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he pressed. "You and Jacob, you're just drifting apart. You know that." The truth in his words stung, and though I wanted to leave, to walk away from this conversation, I couldn't move. Henry stepped closer, and when our hands brushed accidentally, the touch sent a shockwave through me, stirring something I had been desperately trying to ignore. And in that moment, as the ocean roared softly behind us, I realized the line between what was right and what was wrong had blurred, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to pull away. The next day, the beach seemed even quieter, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jacob was off surfing, Mom was at the spa, and I was left alone, trying to drown my thoughts in the endless rhythm of the waves. But Henry found me again. "Fancy a walk?" he asked, standing beside me with that same knowing look. I hesitated, but found myself saying, "Why not?" though a storm of conflicting emotions was brewing inside me. The walk along the beach felt innocent, but with each accidental touch, each lingering glance, the tension between us grew, and with it, a sense of inevitability. As we continued walking along the beach, the tension between Henry and me became palpable, almost suffocating. Each step felt like I was moving further away from the safety of the life I had built with Jacob, and towards something I didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" Henry asked, stopping at the edge of the water, his voice cutting through the sound of the waves. "Yeah, it is," I replied. Though my mind wasn't on the scenery, I stole a glance at him, trying to read the expression on his face. His eyes were focused on the horizon, but I knew he wasn't thinking about the view. When he finally turned to look at me, there was something different in his gaze, something deeper. His stare lingered just a bit too long, as if he was searching for something in me, something unspoken. I felt it then, like a quiet shift in the atmosphere, an acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that had been simmering between us. It wasn't the brotherly concern I had known for years. It was something else entirely, something that made my stomach twist, with a mix of excitement and dread. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to break the silence, though my voice came out strained. "No, just thinking," he replied, his tone softer than usual, almost too soft. His eyes flickered to mine, and in that moment, I could feel it. Something between us had already changed. I could sense it in the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to be waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what was happening between us. I laughed, trying to deflect the tension, but the sound was hollow. "We should head back," I said quickly, stepping away from the water. My heart was racing, and I knew that if I stayed in this moment any longer, I would lose control. Henry didn't move at first. He just watched me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name, something that frightened and intrigued me in equal measure. Then, after what felt like an eternity, He nodded and followed me back toward the bungalow. That night, the air between us felt even thicker, heavier. Jacob and my mom were out shopping for dinner, and for the first time being alone with Henry felt dangerous. We sat on the veranda, trying to make small talk, but the conversation quickly veered into more personal territory. Henry brought up memories from our childhood, times when we were closer, when everything was simple and innocent. "You know," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "you've always been more than just a stepsister to me." The words hung in the air, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to him, the moonlight casting shadows across his face, but his expression was clear. There was no ambiguity in his words. "What does that mean?" I asked, though my voice trembled, betraying the calm I was trying to project. Henry didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his gaze intense and unwavering. Then, as if he couldn't hold back any longer, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was soft, almost tentative, as if he was testing my boundaries, waiting to see if I would pull away. But I didn't. I froze, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt, but my body didn't move. I didn't push him away. It lasted only a moment, but that single moment changed everything. When Henry pulled back, the silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't speak, couldn't even process what had just happened. All I knew was that something had shifted irreparably between us, and I had no idea how to handle it. Henry began, but he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The damage was done, and we both knew it. The next day, I did everything I could to avoid him. I spent the morning with Jacob clinging to the routine of our vacation as if it could erase the memory of that kiss. We played volleyball on the beach, went for a swim, and even joined my mom for a boat ride. But no matter how hard I tried to lose myself in the activities, the weight of what had happened with Henry clung to me like a shadow. Henry kept his distance, but I could feel his eyes on me whenever we were in the same space. We didn't talk about the kiss, but the unspoken tension between us was undeniable. Every time our paths crossed, my chest tightened with anxiety and guilt. I knew I had to end it, had to stop whatever was happening between us before it went too far. But the truth was, it already felt like it had, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. One evening, Jacob suggested we take a walk around the island. I eagerly agreed, desperate for any distraction from the chaos in my mind. We wandered along the narrow paths, talking about our life back home, our future plans, normal, safe conversations that I clung to as if they could ground me. But even then, in those quiet moments with Jacob, the guilt gnawed at me. Every time he smiled, every time he touched my hand, I felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me. As we reached a secluded part of the island, Jacob stopped and turned to me, a soft smile on his face. "I'm glad we came here," he said, pulling me into a hug. "I think it's exactly what we needed." I nodded, but my heart was heavy. I didn't deserve his kindness, his love. Not after what I had done. That night, as I lay next to Jacob in bed, the guilt became unbearable. I knew I had to end things with Henry, to put a stop to the feelings that had been simmering between us. But I also knew that whatever I said to Henry, whatever happened next, things between us would never go back to the way they were. The next morning, after Jacob and my mom had left for the beach, I found Henry on the veranda, staring out at the ocean. I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. Henry turned to me, his expression unreadable. He knew what was coming. We can't keep doing this," I said, forcing the words out. "Whatever this is between us, it has to stop." Henry's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. "I love Jacob," I continued, my voice breaking. "He's my husband, and I can't betray him like this. I won't." Henry stepped closer, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might try to convince me that what was happening between us was something real, something worth pursuing. But instead, he just nodded, the pain in his eyes mirroring my own. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. "But that doesn't make it any easier." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "No, it doesn't." We stood there in silence, the weight of what we were giving up hanging heavy in the air between us. I knew this was the right thing to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like loss, like something important had slipped through my fingers, something I would never get back. The next day, we packed our bags and left the island. Mom and Henry went their way, and Jacob and I returned to ours. The silence on the way home was thick, but it wasn't just the silence of a finished vacation. It was the silence of a choice I had made for my marriage, for Jacob. But as the plane lifted off, I couldn't help but wonder if I had truly left everything behind on that island, or if it had followed me home, lurking in the shadows of what was supposed to be a fresh start. Back home, the days passed in a blur, and although life seemed to return to normal on the surface, I felt anything but normal. Each morning, I woke with a sense of dread in the pit of my stomach, and every night, I lay in bed beside Jacob, haunted by memories of that kiss with Henry, by the guilt that weighed heavier with each passing day. Jacob seemed oblivious, or maybe he was just choosing not to notice the change in me. He returned to his routine, burying himself in work and the usual distractions. We continued going through the motions, making dinner together, watching TV in the evenings, sharing quiet moments. But the connection that had once been effortless between us now felt strained, forced. Every time he reached for my hand, I was reminded of the betrayal I hadn't confessed. I knew I had to tell him. Every time I thought about the kiss with Henry, the guilt gnawed at me, making it impossible to fully enjoy even the simplest moments with Jacob. But the fear of what telling him would do to our marriage kept me silent. I had made the decision to end things with Henry, but could I still salvage what I had with Jacob? The turning point came one evening when Jacob and I were sitting at the dinner table. We were halfway through our meal when he set down his fork and looked at me, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sarah, is something wrong?" he asked. His voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it, as if he had been holding back this question for weeks. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why do you ask?" "You've been different," he said slowly, watching me carefully. "Ever since we got back from the island, you seem distant." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth sat on the tip of my tongue, but fear held me back. How could I admit what I had done? How could I tell him that I had let myself get too close to Henry, that I had crossed a line? Jacob sighed, rubbing his hand across his forehead. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me. You know that, right?" His kindness made it worse. It made the lie I was living feel even more unbearable. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, and I knew I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I had to tell him the truth, even if it meant losing him. "Jacob," I began, my voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked up, concern deepening in his eyes. "What is it?" My hands were shaking as I placed my fork down, struggling to find the courage to speak. While we were on the island, something happened, something I regret more than anything. Jacob's expression shifted from concern to confusion. He leaned forward, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I kissed Henry," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could second-guess them. "It was a mistake, and it only happened once, but I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was unbearable. Jacob stared at me, as if he hadn't heard me correctly, as if he couldn't process what I had just said. Then, slowly, the realization settled in. his face drained of color, his expression twisting in disbelief and pain. "You kissed Henry?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. It was a moment of weakness. I choked on my words, struggling to explain something that felt inexplicable. I regret it. I ended it as soon as it happened, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer. Jacob stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with such force that it scraped loudly against the floor. He paced the kitchen, running his hands through his hair, his breathing uneven. "Henry, your stepbrother? How could you, Sarah?" he demanded, his voice cracking with hurt and disbelief. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I love you, Jacob. It wasn't about him. It was just... I don't know why I let it happen. I'm so sorry." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. "How am I supposed to trust you after this?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our entire marriage, and with Henry, of all people." I broke down, unable to hold back the tears any longer. "I know," I sobbed. "I know I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even know if you can, but I couldn't live with this lie anymore. I needed to tell you the truth." Jacob stood there, staring at me as if he didn't recognize the person in front of him. The man who had always been calm and composed now looked lost, broken. He shook his head, turning away from me as if he couldn't bear to look at me anymore. "I need some time," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't deal with this right now." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving me alone at the table, my heart shattered. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, and I realized that I might have just lost him for good. The hours that followed felt like an eternity. I sat in the darkened living room, my mind racing, replaying the moment I had told Jacob the truth over and over again. I didn't know where he had gone, if he would come back, or if this was the end of everything we had built together. Finally, hours later, I heard the door open, and Jacob stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes red and tired. He didn't say anything as he sat down next to me on the couch, the space between us vast and cold. "I don't know how to feel," he said quietly, his voice raw. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. I can't believe you would do this to me, Sarah." "I know," I whispered, wiping away my tears. "I know I broke your trust, and I don't know if I can ever earn it back, but I want to try. I love you, Jacob. I don't want to lose you." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I love you too," he finally said, his voice strained. "But this is going to take time. I don't know if I can just forgive you, Sarah, but I'm willing to try." It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, but it was a glimmer of hope. We sat there in the silence, not touching, not speaking, both of us knowing that this was just the beginning of a long, painful road. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance we could find our way back to each other. And maybe one day we would.